Hi everyone, welcome to this new video, and today we will be studying this new Aeon essay, which is The Rights of the Dead, written by Anita Guarni. And I also will be maintaining a separate notebook where I will be writing the points, and I also will be uploading them in a separate Google Doc, and I'll also share the link. So yeah, let's start it. In 1786, so in late 1700s, Joshua Reynolds painted a portrait. Okay, so this person, Joshua Reynolds, is a painter. Painted a portrait of the surgeon and anatomist John Hunter. Okay, so this person is being painted. Reynolds depicted Hunter gazing into the distance, caught in mid-thought, quill in hand. So he is describing what's the setting and the background. On the table in front of him, apart from inkwell and paper, are some books, one propped open to a page comparing the skulls and arm bones of humans and apes. Okay, so probably this guy Hunter was some means he did some anatomical things and he studied anatomy basically in biology probably. Next to the books is an anatomical specimen under a glass dome. In the upper right hand corner is a mantle, which means a shelf, holding another anatomical specimen in a glass jar. Okay, so there are few anatomical specimens here and there. A pair of large skeletal feet suspended in the air next to the jar hint at the large skeleton attached to them and hanging from the ceiling. So there is a large skeletal feet in the picture as well. So yeah, that's the painting. So that's the basic description of how the painting looks like and the background of that. Okay, so let's continue reading. And the painting was well known, particularly after an engraving of it was made in 1788. So after that, in 1788, another engraving was being made. So it made the painting famous or the portrait famous, and the dangling feet were also famous. So the dangling feet also came into the picture. Their inclusion in the portrait indicated that Hunter owned them. Okay, so yeah, so that's common, and the skeleton to which he had reattached them. However, in life, they had belonged to the Irish giant Charles Byrne. So whatever it is, so these legs belong to a person named Charles, and here the story begins probably. I first saw Charles's skeleton decades ago in the Hunterian Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London, among jars of preserved anatomical specimens that included an 18th century bishop's cancerous rectum. So there are few organs and skeletons and etc. Present in the museum, and the author went to see it decades ago. And yeah, the last time I saw this skeleton in 2016, so not quite long ago, it was recent. I was not allowed to photograph it. Okay. In the following year, the outcome of the case of an ancient skeleton in the United States brought to a head long simmering issues surrounding the rights of the dead against the rights of the museum to display the remains and of scientists to learn from them. Okay, so there has been a issue or a dispute between people who support the rights of people, dead people, and the some support that there's a debate going on that whether museums should keep the dead bodies for anatomical and research purposes or not. So yeah, that's the focal point. The contrast are okay, so yeah, I read it. The contrast are many between Byrne and the man who died 8,500 years ago. So this is a skeleton the author talked about recently, and was buried along what is known as the Columbia River near Kennewick in Washington State. So it's in US. Nonetheless, there are similarities between them. So, despite having dissimilarities in location and geographic location, there are some similarities which the author will mention. They share stories of identity and ownership in the aftermath of colonialism. So, yeah, they show how colonialism works probably. More broadly, both men seem to epitomize science's appropriation of individual identities in the service of a larger impersonal goal of knowledge that is presumably will benefit humankind. Okay, so there's also a issue that there's a similarity rather between these two men that they are affected by colonization, and even after that their bodies are being colonized or captured or claimed by the contemporary human beings or the contemporary world, to be precise, for the means source of information and for research purposes and science, etc. By this argument, a dead body has no value other than as a source of information, as the author said. Yet the stories of these two men, vastly separated in place and time, are not merely stories of a cold and rapacious science, but of the intertwined desires and beliefs that the living project onto the dead, both in the 18th century and today, both among scientists and among others who lay claim to the bodies of dead. So, in the post-colonial era, we are too much attached to things, and we claim things which are others and not ours to be ours. So that's what the author is saying. We try to occupy and procure and claim and acquire things. Yeah. So despite it not being ours. So yeah, that's what the author is saying for knowledge purposes. For several years, Charles Byrne, born in 1761 in County Derry, exhibited himself for a fee to the public at fairs, at taverns, coffee houses, and at private homes across Ireland and Britain. Newspaper advertisements and broadsides breathlessly proclaimed him to be the tallest man in the world, at a height of 8 feet 2 inches. We know little about him apart from his height, which was actually 7 feet 7 inches. His parents were of normal size, but since he hired himself out for money while still in his teens, they were most likely poor. So yeah, that's what the description of his childhood is. His handlers dressed him in the height of 1780s fashion, with silk stockings, blah blah blah, and that's means how the people dressed him like to in these taverns, coffee houses, fairs, etc. Yeah. So the broadside described him as the modern living colossus or wonderful Irish giant, noting his admirable symmetry and proportion and his vivacity and spirit. So he was quite famous back in the days, and yeah, that's what the author is saying. So this is a picture of one of these advertisements, I suppose. Byrne's Irishness was part of his appeal. He was sometimes referred to himself as O'Brien, invoking an ancestry going back to semi-mythical 11th century Irish king Brian Boru, who was in some tales was a giant. Okay, so yeah, that was a story of himself. In Hilary Mantel's novel The Giant O'Brien, Byrne is a storyteller, a myth spinner, in contrast to Hunter's cold rationality. So right now the author is saying that this person Byrne had some personality, had some features, had some history and etc. His childhood and all. So apart from Hunter, which means the person in the picture or in the portrait mentioned in the beginning of the passage, apart from the cold rationality of that person, the Byrne was a person like he was a human, like we all are. So yeah, Byrne is a storyteller, he's a myth spinner, etc. But he still is being treated as a source of a skeleton, right? Byrne was not the first Irish giant to display himself, and and he would not be the last. Patrick Cotter, who was really 8 feet tall, assumed Byrne's role after his death. So yeah, the Patrick Cotter, this person, took Byrne's place after Byrne's death. He also called himself O'Brien, and the two merged in popular imagination. So these two served the same purpose in 1760s or probably 1780s. Okay. Um, by the spring of 1783, only a year after his triumphant entry into London, Byrne was in constant pain, his bones cracking under his weight. So these are the problems Byrne was facing. Newly destitute, robbed of his life, so new problems robbed of his life savings, and he was busily drinking himself to death. So he had some poor choices in life also. He was 22 years old, and he knew that Hunter wanted his body after he died. So he was aware of the fact that Hunter wanted his body for research purposes. The anatomist had offered to pay Byrne a sum of money, so it was open. So Hunter offered a sum of money to Byrne probably if he would bequeath him his body. This was not an uncommon practice. 40 years earlier, the Irish dwarf Owen Farrell had made just such an arrangement with a surgeon. The value of Farrell's bones, at least initially, was a curiosity. They entered the collections of the Duke of Richmond. Hunter's brother William, who purchased the skeleton at an auction after Richmond's death, was more interested in Farrell's abnormally bony cartilage. So, right now, the author is giving us an introduction to this thing that Hunter actually offered Barnes some money for the body if he died. After he died, so Barnes would acquire his body. And there's also a story of a person named Owen Farrell whose body was also acquired by Hunter's brother, who was interested in his body rather, or a smaller body. Byrne knew that if he granted John Hunter's request, his body would share the fate of Farrell's. So he knew the case of Farrell's. Hunter would eviscerate it, dismember it, boil it until the flesh came off, and the thought of these things actually bothered Byrne. Yeah. So these thoughts actually intrigued and concerned Brian. So, let's continue reading. Barnes refused Hunter's offer and took steps to ward off his fate, of this fate, arranging with friends to seal his dead body in a lead coffin and pay for its transport to the coast of for a burial at sea, far from Hunter's predatory hands. So he was aware of the fact that the Hunter wanted this body, and he actually told his friends previously that if he died, his dead body should be sealed and taken to a seashore, far away from Hunter's reach, or perhaps the burial was to be in Ireland. There are many accounts and they say different things. The announcement of Barnes' death in Parker's General Advertiser in June 1763 noted that Barnes died in 1783. Sorry, not 63, 83. Noted that his remains are secured in coffin which measures upwards of 8 feet 4 inches. Although his friends were determined to have him carried to Ireland in a few days, they first offered to show the coffin to public. So Byrne's friends were also not loyal to Byrne. So they actually showcased his body for a fee of 2 shillings. Means they actually monetized his dead body. That's what the author is suggesting. The coffin never made it either to Ireland or to the coast. So accounts also differ of how Hunter obtained Barnes. So eventually Hunter obtained or acquired Barnes' body. The London Morning Chronicle declared that Hunter paid 125 guineas, more than 20,000 pounds today, for the body. So that was quite expensive back in the day. Others claim that he paid 500 pounds. Possibly the friends who exhibited the coffin sold the body to Hunter, so they did not follow the instructions given by Barnes. In any case, Barnes' next public appearance was his skeletonized feet in Reynolds' portrait. So that was the first public encounter of Barnes' feet, Barnes' body actually, part of the body. Hunter declared that his interest in Barnes was purely scientific. Examining the extremes of the nature as well as normal specimens gave him insights into the inner workings. He amassed an enormous collection of human and animal skeletons, skulls, and anatomical preparations, housed both at his home in Leicester Square and his country house at Earl's Court. Okay, so where he also maintained a menagerie or probably a collection. Sorry. While his collections were primarily for his own research, from 1788 onward, he opened his home at Leicester Square for public viewing a few times a month. Okay, he put the skeleton of Byrne on display as a part of a case depicting the growth of bones. Okay, so Hunter actually acquired Byrne's body for academic purposes, but eventually he opened or showcased Byrne's body in or skeleton, to be precise, in his museum in Leicester Square. Hunter died in 1793, and in 1799 his anatomical collections or possessions, including Barnes' skeleton, were purchased by the British government and transferred to Company of Surgeons, which later became the Royal College of Surgeons of England. Okay, so this was the aftermath of Hunter's death. The college's museum was opened in 1813, and Barnes' skeleton remained on display there for the next 2 centuries. In 1909, a US surgeon sawed open Barnes' skull and found evidence of the pituitary tumor that caused the release of excessive amounts of growth hormone. So pituitary gland actually secretes growth hormone. So that's what the problem was, or the deformity was in Barnes' case. Later, DNA was extracted from one of Barnes' teeth. At some point in 19th century, another skeleton joined Barnes on display. Known as the Sicilian fairy, Caroline Krashami died in 1824 at the reputed age of 9. At the time of her death, she was around 20 inches or 50 centimeters tall, which means she was a dwarf, the size of a newborn infant, making her one of the smallest humans ever recorded. The two skeletons survived the Blitz in 1941, which destroyed much of Hunter's collection. So there was a Blitz which destroyed Hunter's collection, but they survived the blow. But were put in storage in 2017 when museum closed for renovation. So they were kept in storage, but for the museum renovation, but they survived the Blitz. A second story of identity and ownership of a dead body began in the summer of 1996 when some teenagers found a skull along the bank of Columbia River. The man who had been buried there some 8,500 years ago was tall for his time, at around 5 feet 7 inches, but he was not a giant. His burial was deliberate, with his body laid on its back parallel to the river and with his head pointed upstream. So the author is giving a brief description of what happened in 1996, where a group of people or a group of kids found a skull of probably a man. When his skull eventually emerged from the riverbank, time had already removed his skin and hair and his eyes and tongue. The teenagers who found it assumed it to be belonged to a victim of a murder and called the police. The nearest town, Kennewick, is near the confluence of the Columbia with the. So the author gives a geographic description of the place. To the west and the Snake River to blah blah blah. The skull came to a local coroner who was James Chatters, who was called James Chatters, a local archaeologist, to determine if it belonged to a crime victim. Chatters recognized that the skull was quite old, and by judging by its shape, he first believed that it belonged to a white settler. So he believed that there was a white person who migrated to America and he settled there, and that was the skull of him. Returning to the site, he found some 300 bones and fragments, nearly a complete skeleton. Carbon 14 testing or carbon testing on a finger bone initially established its age at around 9,000 years old. So it was quite old, and it was not definitely a case of crime victim. The emergence from the muddy shore of these bones, who came to be called either Kennewick Man or the Ancient One, depending on the speaker, opened a 20-year debate about ownership. So there was an issue around this fact. Heritage and science. Although this story was in some ways uniquely American, it also sparked global disputes that are still ongoing. So it also created a few issues apart from this American thing. The McNally Dam site is owned, or the site where the skeleton was found, is owned by the US government and managed by the US Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps issued the permits that allowed chatters to find more of the skeleton, and once the age of the bones became clear, the Corps took possession of them. So the Corps acquired the skeleton eventually. Since they dated from long before 1492, the course of action for the corps seemed clear. Under the provisions of the 6-year-old Native American Graves Protection, um, the NAGPRA, so I'm taking the shortcut. If the bones were of a pre Columbian, they were by definition Native American. If the bones were Native American, the corps was obligated to repatriate them to the local tribes. So there was a case that if the skeleton was found to be of a Colombian origin, it was of Native America, and so the corps had to give or to return this skeleton back to the local tribes. So yeah, that is the case. Five local not Native American tribes had already claimed Kennewick Man as an ancestor, the ancient one. If the bones were Native American, the corpse was obligated to repatriate them to the local tribes or to return them to the local tribes if it found to be Native American or Colombian. Five local Native American tribes had already claimed Kennewick Man as an ancestor, the ancient one. Okay, so they already called the skeleton as the ancient one. At this point, only a few months after the discovery of the bones, Kennewick Man was already renowned and in the archaeological world. So it was famous in the archaeological world after its discovery. At the time, few bones of such an advanced stage and not only other one other skeleton had been found in North America. So it was quite a unique and rare thing to be done. Theories of the populating of North America, including when it occurred, where it originated, and by which route, were in flux after years of consensus. So the historical context, the geographical context was in debate after the discovery of the skeleton for a few years. New methods of analyzing using including CAT scans and 3D modeling help to reconstruct what skeletal bodies looked when alive when stable isotope while stable isotope analysis which considers the ratio of the stable isotopes of carbon and the nitrogen in bones reconstructed the diets and the origins of the long dead. These and other methods were changing the picture of the late Ice Age America. Most exciting was the potential of DNA analysis, which was in its infancy or which was in its beginning stage in the 1990s. Chatters had just sent a finger bone out for DNA analysis when the corps ordered him to stop any further testing. Okay, so the author gives a context about the analyzing and the study regarding this skeleton. So the author is saying that there were new technologies such as CAT and 3D modeling, which helped to construct the actual face and the actual body of the person with the help of the skeleton only. And there were also few technologies such as uh, co- stable isotope analysis, which actually predicted the diet of the people just using the skeleton. So yeah, these are the few technologies the author is talking about. A group of anthropologists and archaeologists sued the corpse to prevent repatriation. So repatriation is actually the returning of a object to its original birthplace, arguing that the identity of the bones had not been yet determined and that therefore NAGPRA did not apply to them. So, a group of anthropologists actually protested the fact that the skeleton should be returned back to its homeland. So, they told that they need more study and research upon the actual uh, deterministic homeland. They pointed to the need for further study, which the five tribes strenuously opposed, calling for the bones to be buried without further analysis. So these five tribes opposed this act of researching and analyzing the skeleton. So they told that they needed the skeleton to be buried without further analysis. Ironically, and this case is drenched in irony, because the federal court agreed that the identity of these bones could be determined only scientifically. The scientists were free to conduct studies, so the tribes' request was not granted clearly. Scientists were free to conduct studies to determine the identity. These studies mostly focused on craniometry, the size and shape of the skull, which many believed to indicate a non-Native American identity. So, the shape of the skull suggested that this person, the skeleton of the person was not Native American. So, person was not Native American. Yeah. Chatters published images of the skull in 1996 and 1997 and identified its shape as Caucasoid, an archaic racial classification that some constructed as racist. So, um, Chatters used a technique which people claim to be racist. The facial reconstruction Chatters made from a resin cast of the skull, published in Science magazine in 1998, most resembled the actor Patrick Stewart. Okay, so Chatters also created a depiction of the actual face, which resembled the face of Patrick Stewart. white supremacist groups in the US seized on the Caucasoid label to argue that white Europeans had settled the Americas before any ancestor of modern Native Americans. Okay, so taking this opportunity, white supremacist leaders or groups actually claim that European settlers are far more superior or came before Native American people in the American land. By then, the bones had been deposited in the Burke Museum at the University of Washington, where they remained securely stored and were never displayed. In 2004, judgment in the lawsuit against the corpse declared in favor of the scientists. The settlement opened the door to more detailed study of the remains over the next decade, resulting in what seemed to be the definitive account of the bones. 10 years later saw the publication of the Kennewick Man, the scientific investigation of an ancient American skeleton, 2014, edited by the anthropologists Douglas Ousley and Richard Jans. So the author is suggesting that the skeleton was being kept or stored in the Burke Museum for quite some time, and after that it was again in the scientist's hand for analysis. The study described Kennewick Man as relatively tall, broad-bodied, and massive. But was he an ancestor of modern Native Americans? So the author is also asking the same question, that whether he was from Native America or not. Uh, it is a confusion. Amid an avalanche of data on diet, overall health, and burial conditions, the critical question of identity remained focused largely on the skull. So, the skull was the still the center of focus of every information during that time. Some anthropologists thought it resembled the modern Ainu of Japan, an indigenous people who predate the Japanese, but whose ancient origin remained debated. Okay, so people speculated that whether it was an Ainu of Japan who predated the Japanese and whose origin was under question. So additional analysis suggested that the skull showed most affinity with Polynesians, indicating a common set of ancestors. This theory in turn fit new ideas of multiple migrations from Asia to the Americas, so it's quite understandable, with some traveling across the sea, perhaps predating those who came overland from Siberia or those who were present at America itself, so who were Native Americans. Okay, so let's continue. Ousley and Jans concluded that Kennewick Man differs from modern American Indians in systematic ways. Their difference is mainly genetic and as such carries information about their history and biological affinities, although the proofs they presented were mainly morphological. Throughout the volume, Kennewick Man is referred to a Paleo-American rather than the more common name of Paleo-Indian, in an attempt to demarcate differing ancient groups. A new reconstruction of his face resembled photographs of Ainu men with a full beard and a lightly tanned skin. So, the main gist of this paragraph was there were speculations regarding the origin of this skeleton and the man whose skeleton it was. And some people speculated that it was a Ainu man from Japan, and some said it was Indian, and some said it was from Asia and migrated to America. And some people like Ousley and Jans, they also told the world that he was Paleo American rather than a Paleo Indian. So we got a gist about the paragraph. The author had some question that from where did this skeleton come from and where was it origin, and some people had their opinions about it. So let's continue. A little more than a year after the publication of Ousley's and Jan's volume, the carefully constructed chain of identification fell apart when the results of DNA analysis showed that Kennewick Man is closer to modern Native American. So the myth was busted that he was not a Native American. He was actually a Native American, and DNA test proved it so. An article in Nature magazine in July 2015, authored by a team led by Danish scientist S.K. Willerslev, reported the results of the analysis. The team had sequenced the genome of the Kenwick man and compared it with other populations, particularly other Native American populations. So, quite understandable. The closest relationship appeared with the Confederated tribes of the Colville Reservation, one of the five tribes who had claimed Kenwick man as their as the ancient one nearly 20 years earlier. So they found a similarity between the skeleton and the DNA test proved that so. The Colville tribe was the only one of the five that agreed or they agreed to volunteer to test their DNA. Development of research on what is known as ancient DNA or ADNA had progressed rapidly in a decade before the Nature article. Ancient DNA consists of short and degraded fragments that persist in materials such as bones and teeth, as well as hair, mummified skin, and dental calculus. Although the first sequencing of ADN occurred in 1984 from a museum animal specimen, the technological challenges to obtaining meaningful results from fragmentary and often contaminated evidence took years to overcome. Moreover, the interpretation of ADN evidence required collaboration between bench scientists and social scientists, who had to overcome their mutual suspicion and develop a common vocabulary as well as a chain of ownership between the excavation site or museum and a laboratory that minimized contamination. For example, the bones of Kenwick man had at various times been in a box, in plastic bags, and in an evidence locker before their arrival at the Burke Museum, increasing their chances of contamination with modern DNA at each stop. Okay, so the author is saying right now that these DNA samples is being contaminated by the people who deal with it, and there is a lot of cross contamination because they have been stored in plastic bags and boxes and other kind of stuff. And yeah, so their contamination occurs quite often in this field, so that's why it's a challenging field of investigation. Perhaps most important, the analysis of ADN is necessarily destructive. The sample to be analyzed is reduced to a powder and treated with chemicals that purify the DNA from contaminants, isolate it, and extract and recover fragments. While improved technology has reduced the size of the sample required, the cultural significance of removing even a small sample from an ancient specimen cannot be ignored. So, the process of DNA verification is actually destructive. We have to grind what is the sample, and that's a destructive process, and there's a cultural impact on it. So that's what the author is saying. The results of the ADNA analysis fulfilled NAGPR's requirement of a preponderance of evidence, allowing the corps to declare definitively that Kenwick man belonged to the five tribes who had originally claimed him, and particularly to Colville. The courts confirmed that what the five tribes had said all along, that the ancient one was their ancestor. In February 2017, the Burke Museum turned over the bones to the tribes. As required by the law, that meant all the bits and pieces, including what remained of the finger bone used for DNA testing, thus precluding any further testing. So, the Burke Museum and the corpse returned the skeleton to the tribe, including the DNA sample, and which stopped the skeleton from further testing. The ancient one was reburied in an undisclosed location or a secret location on the Colville Reservation along the Columbia River. Such a resting place was not to be allowed to a skeleton of Charles Byrne. Calls for the burial of his bones, either in an island or at sea, began years before the Hunterian Museum closed for renovations in 2017. These calls intensified during the museum's closure, with Hilary Mantel taking a prominent role. Every inch of Barnes' skeleton had been measured and examined. A tooth had been extracted for DNA testing in 2011. Surely, Mantel and other advocates argued science had learned all there was to learn. He's waited long enough, she said in 2020. DNA testing had revealed that the pituitary tumor that caused Byrne to be a giant had a hereditary component. It was not merely a spontaneous mutation, but had genetic biases, a basis. And the frequency of Irish giants was not merely apparent or coincidental, but quite real. The giant Knight twins, with whom Byrne had been depicted, had grown up in a neighboring village to Byrne, and by this evidence, they were most likely distant cousins. So there has been some cases in Ireland regarding giants. So giant was a common, not a very common, but significantly common compared to other places that to have giants had grown up in a neighboring village to Barnes, and by this evidence, they were most likely distant cousins. So this is understandable. The genetic evidence showed that the giant's trail went back for generations. So it was a quite ancient thing. Ireland really was a birthplace of giants, so it was common in Ireland. However, this evidence, far from persuading the museum that science had learned all there was to learn, led them to conclude that the bones still had more to tell. So, science means the archaeologists and other scientists still believed that there was some more information required from those bones and skeleton. A scientist who had examined Kennewick Man would certainly agree with this assessment. So the scientists dealing with the skeleton of the Kennewick man also still tried to uh, acquire the skeleton for a longer time. DNA analysis and particularly the analysis of ancient DNA has been refined further and further in the past decade. Unlike Kennewick man, Byrne has not been buried, although his skeleton was no longer on display when the Hunterian Museum reopened in May 2023. He remains in the museum as osteo 0.223 available for future research. So Barn skeleton has still been kept in the museum but is still not in use, and it will be used as told by the museum, and the name was under Osteo 0.223. The tiny skeleton of Caroline Krashami, the dwarf mentioned above in the passage, Osteo.227, also remains in the storage at the museum. Okay. These stories affirm that the way the living have treated dead bodies throughout history is never about the dead bodies but about themselves. So it's the main theme of the passage right now. We have understood that people treat dead bodies like as if it were their own, and without giving any importance to the people or the person whose dead body it is. So rather than giving importance to that or considering that, people take dead bodies as granted and as their own. They claim their the bodies actually. So that's the thing which has been talked about in the passage. The living give the bodies the living give the bodies of the dead and thus their own bodies meaning, whether as relics, museum displays, scientific objects, blah blah blah. Their status and colonial subjects made the remains of Barn and the ancient one particularly vulnerable to exploitation. In Byrne's time, certain fields in Ireland were still littered with bones and skulls, the result of Oliver Cromwell's brutal reconquest. So there was the person named Oliver Cromwell who conquered Ireland in 1650s, and he also did some mass killings. That's what the author is saying. Byrne and his contemporaries assumed that they owned their own bodies, believing therefore that they could control their disposition after death. Okay. But in Byrne's case, he rejected the coldly transactional arrangements made by his countryman Owen Farrell or the dwarf, hoping to escape the fate of Farrell's bones. Okay. Although Mantle portrayed Byrne as a deeply spiritual man steeped in Irish mythology, in fact, we know little about his spiritual or emotional life or of his wider community. So, Mantle or the protester who protested for Byrne told that he was a spiritual man. In contrast, the transformation of Kennewick man into the ancient one owed to the unwavering values of Native American communities who claimed the ancient one as their own. So, the um, tribe also played a part in the acquiring of the skeleton of the Kennewick man, of course. However, the US government accepted these values only when science affirmed the claims. Okay, so the author is saying right now that government or administrative agencies also believe science only rather than the taking culture into consideration. Moreover, although the ancient one sleeps beneath the banks of Columbia once more, forever lost to science, Native American bones and artifacts remain in anthropology departments and museum collections around the world. Okay, so the author is saying that we have the example of Kennewick Man, which has been given back to the community, but still there are cases where there are bones and artifacts which also bear a cultural significance has been treated as artifacts in a museum. Okay, so the author she is not liking the fact probably as she is suggesting the facts against the laws. The values of the community who have demanded the burial of Bayan are more diffuse, and the laws that govern the display of human remains in Britain are loosely interpreted unless the remains are under 100 years old. So the author is saying that Bayan's burial is still in question and it's a vague topic to talk about right now. And the laws of means the conservation of skeleton and the other things, human remains in Britain are still very loose right now. And it is unless the remains are 100 under 100 years old. Other than that, they keep remains as an archaeological property. Okay, so yeah, let's continue. In which case, they are subject to stricter regulation. Barnes bone hang in a storage room. So the author is again continuing the fact that Barnes bone hang in the same storage room in the same museum, and it will be used for the benefit of science and human beings. Means the alive human beings who are alive right now, and they will use the skeleton for their own benefit. And yeah, that's the situation right now, and it cannot be helped with. In a place of the skeleton itself, visitors to the museum can view Reynolds' depiction of his feet hanging over Hunter's mantle. Okay, just as people can see in the picture, people can also see in the future. People can also see when the skeleton comes out of the storage. They can also watch it, and science can also do more investigations on it. So ultimately, people and their products can only benefit from the skeleton, and we do not give any importance to the dead body and the person who was there behind it. um, okay, so yeah, that's I think that's it for the passage, and see you in the next video.